Hi, welcome to Public Access. Today, we're going to be talking about something pretty important happening in our city. You might have heard in states all across this country, from California to New York to Texas, that there are students organizing encampments in order to have solidarity with the Palestinian cause at the moment. This newest form of protest from young people in this country isn't the first form. We've covered it before here on this channel, and I'm excited to be talking today with one of the organizers from that encampment. Talking with us from the UNM Solidarity Encampment is here with me, Siihasin. Thank you for joining me, Siihasin. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you because I have seen this kind of permanent encampment at UNM, this continual solidarity, to be a really interesting form of protest because you don't just go into the street, march a little bit, have your signs and go home. You guys are staying out there night by night, rain by wind, police berating you guys. You're staying out there for a long time to have this kind of protest. I'd like to know, Siihasin, what is your background with this and why is it so important to you to stay out there for this long duration of time? Why is that the form of protest you guys have chosen?
Thank you. That is a great question. So I'll first start by saying Yat-A. My name is Siihasin, and I'm Dené. And I like to name that my people have been in struggle and in encampments throughout our existence for time immemorial. And a lot of indigenous people's communities function in a very communal way. So these types of encampments are pretty familiar for us because we are used to having to work together. We are used to having to coordinate with one another to make ceremonial things or cultural practices happen. And so it's been a struggle because this is an urban encampment in a space that is centering a specific message around freeing an oppressed people and the liberation of people who are actively experiencing genocide. And so I feel like some of the reasons I have come to this work is because of my connections to my community, my obligations to my tribal community, as well as my cultural practices. I have learned how to really articulate my values as a land defender and as a water protector throughout the years in the work that I do for land defense and water protection. I'm a frontliner from different camps that have been a part of movements to uplift the rights of indigenous people, uplift our rights to clean water, to clean air, to protecting the rights of Mother Earth, as well as the rights of the life that lives upon it.
Well, you know, I have to ask, you're a co-founder of Red Nation,
Yes.
Which is a brilliant organization that does a lot of activism for indigenous peoples here in our state. And I'm really curious on to how you've come to a point where the issues in Palestine have become kind of at the forefront of what you're looking at here. We asked a question on this channel before, which is colonialism over? And we got to the answer on that one with the UNM professor, that perhaps if you are wishing to continue that definition, that you're changing the definition of colonialism. It seems to me that this idea of land occupation is at the center of it. You're protesting illegally occupied land in Palestine. You're doing so by occupying land in a university. It seems this concept of who has the right to hold land is really important here. So I wanted to ask you that question today of, you know, what is colonialism over? And I'm curious, in the perspective of this protest, how do you see those land rights? As you said, you're a land protector. How does that play into it for you, and how do you come to that answer with that?
Thank you for that question. So yes, I had spent a lot of years in the Red Nation. I'm currently not an active member, but I wanted to share that I was politicized and cared for and found community and love and family in the Red Nation. And it was through that kinship that we had built that I was able to learn about what was happening in Palestine and learn about colonialism, settler colonialism, talking about U.S. imperialism, and the ways that systems impact indigenous lifeways, but not just indigenous lifeways, those who are oppressed and those who are laborers, those who are migrants, those who are struggling under these systems because we do not have direct access to wealth. And so when we talk about settler colonialism and colonialism, which are a little bit different but also one and the same, colonialism has been something that I would say is an ongoing project. It's not just an event. It's not just one specific thing that takes place. It's a process of slow and meticulous violence that, for me, is better articulated in this context as settler colonialism. Settler colonialism was coined by Patrick Wolfe, and he had explicitly named that settler colonialism was the elimination of the native and the indoctrination and assimilation of those peoples into a foreign or different system outside of that community. And so for me, the answer is colonialism is still ongoing. Colonialism has not ended. Settler colonialism is alive and well, and we can see it today in the way that indigenous systems, lifeways, and even structures are being demolished, are being completely, what's the word? Threatened. I mean, like one of the examples that I want to name is like in a place like here in so-called New Mexico, thinking about our state capital, which some people would call Santa Fe, but the ancestral name is Ogopoge, the white shell watering place.
The white shell watering place?
Yes. Wow. And if you look at where the cathedral and the Santa Fe Plaza is placed, they directly placed those institutions, specifically the church institution, on top of a sacred water spring as a means of domination and conquering.
The massive church that's at the center of the old town that draws so many tourists into our state, that's built upon that. Wow. Yes,
and the plaza where they have so many events, including the infamous Swaya, the Southwest Indian Market, that's the place where they had actually taken a lot of those peoples and sold them into slavery and hung over 70 Pueblo men. And so the reality is that there's a lot of history that a lot of people are not aware of. And that is part of this process of settler colonialism. It's the elimination of Native people and talking about us as if we are a past tense, as if we are primitive, and infantilizing us to the point where it justifies this violence and this need for saving the man and killing the Indian, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's something that I like to articulate is in the heart of what this colonial regime that occupies our land is. Because a lot of people don't understand their relationship to land, but also their relationship to this system. But as Native people, we are a permanent reminder as we continue to exist that there was a life here, there was a system here that was beautiful, that was considered even a wonder. If you think about Chaco Canyon and you think about some of our sacred sites, there are things that cannot be explained about some of those sacred spaces. And so for us, we've always protected those spaces. It is very much, for me, a belief that when we protect those places, when we protect the land, we are like the land itself, defending itself. And that's how we see our relationship.
That's really, well, I recently got back on a trip from Navajo Nation, and understanding that relationship that the person is supposed to have with the land, and the way that your responsibility as a leader, as a member of society, is to that land and is to protect it. So it seems at the heart of what you believe here is about land. It's about your connection to that land and why it's important to fight and protect for that land. So there's a lot of things that in your own culture, in the Dené culture, that have to fight for that. There's a lot of injustice in that regard, and I'm curious on how you, as an activist, approach these things. You have been part of a lot of different protests. You helped shut down the Israeli consulate when they were here about a month ago. You've been part of, you were at the Jerry Seinfeld protest when he was here. So when people come here, you kind of seem to have an energy of being able to recognize there's someone who's on the other side of that land dispute. So how do you identify someone that you're really at odds with as the settler colonialist? How is that easily identified in your mind? And why do you choose your approach in the way you do towards those kind of issues in regards to certainly the Palestine cause?
Well, like talking about colonialism and talking about our relationship to occupations of indigenous lands like the United States and the way that they occupy native lands here, we see our struggles one and the same with how Palestinians are being occupied by settlers in so-called Israel, and the ways that they have perpetuated violence in order to enact that occupation on them. And so for me, when I think about these struggles and I think about these movements in particular, I see them as one and the same. I see the ways that there are direct parallels between the forms of violence that is happening here and there. Like thinking about here how Native people are placed in reservations just draws parallels to the way that Palestinian peoples have been forced to be segregated under the Oslo Accords in different sections A, B, and C, as well as just seeing the way that there are people in Navajo Nation who do not have access to running water and electricity. I draw parallels to the Palestinian struggles where Jewish homes have access to running water, but Palestinian homes have water tanks on top of their home. And so there's a very, very specific ways in which colonialism makes itself known, the ways that it impacts not just the land, but impacts the people. And we can see it in the way that the systems reinforce that violence. Because unfortunately, and also like realistically, the only way that colonialism can take place is through violence. And it's a very, very hard thing to talk about because unfortunately, we live in a community and a society that has a difficult time talking about the real histories of indigenous peoples and their struggles against genocide and ongoing genocide from here to there. And that's something that I feel like is really, really imperative for why I continue to show up and to be in solidarity with Palestinian people, but not just Palestinian people, also migrant peoples, undocumented peoples, Jewish people, anybody who is struggling under systems of violence. We can draw parallels in our need and our wanting of liberation. And so for me, it's important to name that those are the structures in place, and those are the very direct parallels historically that can be seen and mapped out between our communities. As an indigenous person who has cultural obligations in my community, when I go to my ceremonial spaces and to my cultural spaces, we talk about land and water and each other, kinship, very, very realistically as a part of our daily life and a part of our everyday practices. And so for me, it is a daily practice. It is almost like an obligation to show up if I have capacity to events that are expressing solidarity with people who are struggling under oppression. And I feel like it's important to name that I believe that everybody has a role to play in Indigenous liberation. And when we talk about defining who are settlers versus who are colonizers, because there's a distinct difference.
What is that difference?
So like the way that I like to describe what settlers specifically entails is that those are people that is specifically describing a relationship to land. So if this is not your homeland, if you are not indigenous to this space, that means that you are either a settler or a migrant or refugee. And so those are the ways that we distinctly like name the way that people have moved into specific territories that are not theirs. And
Right.
so for me, it's important to name that because there's nothing wrong with being a settler. There's nothing wrong with people who have come to a different place with the idea of finding home in that place and settling. What's wrong is when they become a colonizer. What's wrong is whenever they come into a space with the intention to occupy, to exploit, to extract from.
To dominate.
And to perpetuate violence as a means to get what they want. And I think that those are the distinct differences. And that's also why it's so important that we don't just talk about colonialism, because a lot of people are impacted by colonialism. But it's a very specific thing to talk about settler colonialism, because it's a long process of domination and occupation that takes place over years, not just like, and generations, not just like one specific event that takes place. So for example, the way that I see my people struggle as a Dené person, again, as a guest here in Tiwa Territories, but as an indigenous person to the Southwest, in relationship to Palestine, we've been seeing this genocide happen for over 75 years, since the Nakba. And it's really important that we name that. Like the Palestinian struggle for liberation is land back. It is striving to have a right to return. The way that I see our struggle here is if you were to add 200 years on top of the Nakba is where we are here in the Southwest. And so we are still striving to have access to our homelands. We are still striving to have access to our sacred sites, to have access to clean water, to have access to clean air, especially in a place where the nuclear industry is so much a part of the colonial project. And we are a sacrifice zone as Indigenous people here. We are people who are expected to just accept that every part of our being, including our relationship to our land and the land itself, is extracted from and is being contaminated. And it's something that needs to happen in order for the settler regime to exist.
That was kind of what we talked about then towards the end of that last time I asked this question about the ends of settler colonialism, just for the examples in our own city that you can see, from the Amazon plant that looms over our city on the horizon, the Intel plant that's in Rio Rancho that brings a lot of industry there. I myself work in the film industry, which is pretty much all about getting foreign dollars into our state. So I'm curious, we talked about a little bit this morning too before this interview, which is where do you end up going forward? How do you take that next step? And is there, you have this concept of settler colonialism. So in a lot of ways, that certainly makes me, to some degree, on the colonizing end of things. So my ancestors came here as the Spanish, and we all here reside in Albuquerque, call the city Albuquerque, take place in our city councils and our state government or our federal government. We are part of that system.
Yes.
And on the outside of that system are the indigenous nations, those First Nations, the U.S. territories that we have all around the world, and as well as the places that we occupy with our bases. All of those are places that our, relationship to the land, as you kind of explained, is one of where we get full access, have that dominance, and have that kind of complete control. You mentioned to me that you were a little disheartened by places like Santa Fe, which promote so efficiently and bottle and sell the native culture. Yes. The fact that the architecture, the music, the pottery, it all is sold to Americans in a very palatable way, and certainly the indigenous community has a lot of opportunity to express themselves in cities like that. But at the end of the day, it seems it's not focused on the suffering of indigenous peoples, on their issues, whether it's the Pueblos, the Dené people in our state, or with all the other native groups all around this country. It's kind of unfathomable how you take that next step then. I mean, besides the really obvious, like taking your land out of trust and updating our treaties to make sure everyone has what they need. But what does that next step look like to you if we're talking about the colonialization aspect? I as an American, you say as a so-called New Mexican, what's the next step for us then in that relationship? How do you picture that relationship?
So I'm going to be really honest in naming that for a lot of indigenous people, we are already living in a post-apocalyptic world. We are already living in a world where a lot of our buildings, our systems have been destroyed. And the only remnants of it is our memory and our practicing of those systems. And so for me, the way that I see my relationship to this land is that we are carrying the baton of the fight against U.S. imperialism and colonialism that our ancestors did before us. And it's an obligation in a lot of ways. Because every time that an indigenous person goes to ceremony, there are specific like sayings and songs and prayers that are said that are tied to the land. And we named the land as a kin. We named life as kin. And it is our obligation as stewards of these territories to protect that. And so in a lot of ways, it's almost innate. It's almost embedded in our identities and our practices through our obligations culturally that we show up however we are able to show up in any opportunity that we are given. And we let our values kind of guide how we show up and how we walk through life, especially in this world and in this moment. And something that I want to name that is really important is that despite all of this violence and despite the system that continues to occupy our homelands, we continue to create joy. We continue to create love and to care, to really show those people who are settlers and migrants and refugees in our territories that we have a system that is sustainable. We have the solutions to all of the climate disasters and the violences that this system that is in place has created. And we continue to model that in the ways that we exist because many of us still continue to practice our traditional life ways. And so that is to name that I feel like my specific role in this movement is to, in a lot of ways, like cheerlead and persuade my community to be reminded that our obligations to the land is not something that we get to pick and choose. It is something that we have to do. It's something that we are expected to do. It is something that we pray to do. And it's something that we also have an obligation to extend to any life that is in our territories, because we're very hospitable and loving and kind people. And yes, we have been met with violence, but we haven't let that violence change us, which is why I think that, like, specifically places like so-called New Mexico, where you have, and here in Tewa territories and so-called Albuquerque, where you have a fourth of every tribal community in this community alone, we are actually here to model that resistance and also that joy and that care. And really just be like, you know, we could live in a world where everybody is housed, where everybody is fed, and everybody has access to water, because we did live that way before, and we've always taken care of people who are in our territories. And so in a lot of ways, we're asking people to be very realistic about the systems that are in place. And like, would you really want to be a part of that? Or would you want to be a part of our communities? Because we've always accepted guests in our territories. We've always adopted people who are willing to steward and care for the land, and adhere to our practices of how we steward the land. And if people are willing to do that, we've always been an accepting people. And I think that's also why we're still here today.
Fair enough, yeah. No, well, I mean, it's hard to kind of imagine a way of approaching this problem in a standoff way. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm really ignorant onto how these problems persist to the way they do. I mean, the concept that all Americans should have running water and the ability for medicine, that shouldn't be a controversial idea, but yet it is. You know, I've seen indigenous communities in which the way that they get a shower is by filling up a plastic tank under their house, which isn't clean to drink out of. You know, they have to buy water bottles if you want to have clean drinking water. Yeah. I don't know if New Mexicans understand that there are other New Mexicans, that is currently their lifestyle, that the average home in Navajo Nation uses, I believe, about 10 times less water than the average house here in the city. That's an incredible amount of less water just to have access to. So, you know, on my personal end, I always try to advocate for these things. I'd like to know, though, from you, as someone who's then on this side of you know, my ancestors came here, we colonized, they invited other colonizers, they came, and now we have this big city of Albuquerque. My relationship to the land, what should that be? What is my role in helping bring that kind of justice to the forefront?
Well, I first want to name that, yes, I think it's important to acknowledge that because of the reality of your ancestors being colonizers, you have benefited from the genocide of indigenous people. Yeah, no, and that's important to me. We live
here now, yeah. That's an incredible benefit, I'd say.
And there's a lot of people who are in the same boat, and that's not to like shame people or to make people feel bad, because you are not your ancestors, or you have the opportunity to not be them.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that's like the invitation and the encouragement that I like to offer to people who are seeing what's happening in real time, is that you have an opportunity and a moment to recognize and reflect on how you want to engage with this land and how you want to engage in this world, and whether you want to be on the wrong part of history or the right part of history. Because the reality is that history is on our side. Everything is documented regarding like what has happened to my peoples, and it is important to name that we live in a system that does not give access to that education and knowledge and history of what has happened in these territories. And that has greatly contributed to the ignorance and the ways that people exist, not even realizing that indigenous people exist other than the art that is located around this so-called place. And so it's important to name that the way that I see people who are settlers, who are in this space, who are the descendants of those who colonized this place, is that you have to really think about what your relationship is to this land and how you want to be in relationship to these people. And the invitation is always open. The invitation from indigenous people is always open to be a good guest in our territories, and to adhere to our practices, and to learn how to care for the land in a way that is sustainable, so that we are able to live here together as much as we can, because we do have systems for how we can take care of each other. And we have different systems that oftentimes I mean, this system has tried to disrupt. And I just want to speak to how powerful those systems are, that the U.S. empire that is colonizing all over the world with over 800 military bases outside of the United States, that they still have not successfully colonized all of us. And that is something to be said, that we are still in resistance. We are still fighting for our liberation, and we are asking anybody and everybody who is in our territories to join us. If you care about the land, if you care about Mother Earth, if you care about life, if you care about each other, if you care about like your neighbor, then that means that you need to really think about the place that you're in and how you are part of the liberation movement for the things that you love.
And I think that kind of helps me get to more of this kind of final point of where we've been, where we started, which is, you know, right now we're talking to you because you're at UNM at the Duck Pond having a solidarity encampment with, I mean, there's a lot of people who've been going there in and out. There's different events that have been happening there. There's protests that happen there. There are hecklers who come by and heckle you guys and give you guys a hard time. I mean, it's quite the demonstration that I haven't got to see in person before, and I'm pretty lucky to have people like you in our state who are willing to organize that kind of demonstration, so I can even be part of it. That's pretty hard. I mean, I'd like to know in this regard, because, and like you said, we've had 200 years to marinate this problem of colonialization in our country. At least you and me now are at the point where we're no longer Spaniards and native peoples fighting each other. At least now we can have a nice sit-down interview. You know, that's pretty you know, friendly. We're not there in Israel right now. Right now, the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians is pretty violent, pretty desperate, and and who actually is going to get those kind of land rights they're talking about? That's a hard one to even fathom. So you're here in solidarity for them. That might be a bit of a harder issue to come, right? Because right now, both the people, their solutions involve guns. That's hard. That's a hard one to get through. I'm curious if you could give advice as an Indigenous person from this point of view, from our place where now our societies have had time to war, hurt, heal to some degree. Now we can talk. What's your advice to a people that are a lot more in pain and a lot more volatile about these issues?
I would like to name that no matter how much time passes, there is no healing that comes from somebody who has a knife in their back. And until the knife is removed, we can't heal.
That's a good line.
And so for Indigenous people, I would say that we are still actively hurting. We are still actively being genocided. And it looks different in that some of our people, including like some of the settlers and the folks who have settled and migrants who have integrated into our communities, are not completely aware of that history. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist and there's not rifts inside our communities. I feel like it's important to name that because there is still so much violence that happens in border towns like so-called Albuquerque. Indigenous people going missing all of the time, animals and life going extinct. The Rio Grande the past 2 years has gone completely dry. And then we're seeing like Niagara water bottling company extracting 250 million of gallons of waters from the desert where we don't have water. And we're also seeing like Kirtland Air Force Base completely contaminate our water bases. We're seeing places like the university that have hordes of wealth and resources have their own separate aquifer that is not accessible to the rest of the community. I mean, like, those are all very, very violent systems, and I think that it's important that we recognize it that way.
So you're taking violence then. So that's good to outline. Well, how do you take that violence then that you're experiencing? And I mean, I've met you. You're a fighter. You're a courageous individual. You've been part of a lot of different movements that I wish I had more time to just outline themselves. But you're not a violent person. I don't see you going out and hurting people because you're a gentle soul. You're someone who cares about people, and you're a healer. That's quite powerful to fight people with healing, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
I'm curious in kind of how you see these really violent land disputes, because there's, whether it's not, it's in Israel, the Tuareg people in North Africa, there's a lot of people, you know, the Kurdish, the Armenians, there's a lot of people who struggle to have land. I mean, what's your kind of perspective on, for people who might be in a lot, maybe hard to believe it, worse situations than here in America?
I want to name that, like, what I have to say is something that is very controversial.
Sure.
And what it is that my ancestors fought for me to be here. They fought ruthlessly for me to be here. And I would not be here if they didn't fight for me. And the way that I see this conversation around violence, especially when it's like specifically projected onto movements of liberation, is that the way that I see Indigenous people as well as other people who are occupied and who are oppressed responding to violence, because the reality is that we are being met with violence, which is why we're oppressed. And so the way that I would actually articulate and switch the conversation is that the way that we are responding is in a way of self-defense. And I have seen many people share, like, by any means necessary, we will live and we will survive. And I'd like to name that that's exactly what we plan to do. And that's exactly what my ancestors did in order for me to be here. And I want to share that, like, I unfortunately believe that things are only going to get violent, more violent, in order for it to get better. Because the only thing, and I quote like Frantz Fanon for this in particular, the only thing that will stop a very vicious, violent regime is being met with a greater violence. Because the reality is that there is no accountability for the oppressors and colonizers who are perpetuating this violence. We're seeing it happen in so-called Israel. We're continually seeing it happen for centuries, over 500 years of occupation of the United States in indigenous lands, occupying Turtle Island. That it's only when indigenous people are fighting back, it is only when we are actively occupying spaces, when we are actively resisting, when we are actively protecting each other, yes, but also pushing back is the only times that we have actually ever seen moments of pause in those violence, where we have had small victories, right, and where we have been able to survive, and when we have been able to actually support one another. And so for me, it's really important to name that this system is inherently violent. And so the way that people are responding is a form of self-defense. And we don't normally articulate how like survivors survive violence, honestly. Like when we think about prisoners of war.
I like that.
You know, it's important to name, like, they're going to survive by any means necessary. And we're not here to judge or shame how they've survived. And that's how I would ask people to actually see the way that indigenous people and people who are oppressed are surviving these systems. Not that we are violent, but that we are survivors, and that we are doing everything and anything that we can do to survive, because these systems are so violent towards us on every single day. Since the moment that we are born, we are completely subjugated to the indoctrination and assimilation into a system that tells us that we are not worth, that we don't even exist, but we are also not worth clean water, clean drinking, or clean food, clean air, access to housing. Like, this is an incredibly violent system. We see it every day with our unhoused populations. And I myself am somebody who has lived on the streets. And I always like to ask the question, how can an indigenous person on their homelands be homeless? That is something that I don't understand. And that is an incredibly violent system to place indigenous people in this place where we are suffering in so many different ways. And it's so visible.
Well, you know, you make a point that I try to make often, which is that I think we're lucky that there isn't violence in our country. We take it for granted, and we have an opportunity and a responsibility. If we don't want our relations, if we don't want these kind of things to turn violent, we need to listen, and we need to be allies to indigenous communities. Listen to their problems, listen to their fights, and fight like hell with you guys, because it's not so easy to kind of, you know, put your, like you said, it's surviving. And, you know, we've talked about the violence actually that's happened in Israel, that's happened actually here. The last time we had this conversation, we talked about forms of indigenous violent resistance that worked. And it's clearly something that happens if you're not careful. Clearly, if you hurt and dominate a people too much, that's what you're going to get. And I am truly afraid that, like in Israel and the Palestinians, we might be getting there someday again with our indigenous neighbors. And I don't want that to happen, because I see us as you know, fellow Americans. I do see us as neighbors, as people who can coexist and share land and take care of land, because it takes care of us. And
That's right.
you know, I think you've helped me answer that question a lot more, Siihasin. You know, I just have to ask, you know, for those, I would say you're part of a movement right now that might be a bit more controversial in terms of the encampment. We're going to show some footage on the way out of here, but I'd like to know, kind of, if anyone's questioning why you guys are out there occupying parts of UNM in order to have solidarity with that, what would be your message to those people in our community who are a little unsure of your movement?
I would share that a lot of us inside community, students, community members, alumni, faculty, and staff have been organizing for over 2 months to go through the university's process to encourage them to divest from genocide, because that's what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to take no part in the genocide that is happening outside of these spaces. And that also means acknowledging the genocide that is happening here in the ways that we're participating in that. And I specifically say we by saying the university and those of us tied to it. I wanted to name that the divestment campaign for the university is extremely important because we know that the university has been sending students for over 10 years to so-called Israel to study how colonialism has impacted the land. We know that the university has partnerships with industries and corporations that are creating the bombs and tear gas and weaponry and technology that is that the funds are coming from here to be used and tested on Palestinians and then sent back here. And we are asking that we are not, as students and as people who have a relationship to that institution, that it is not acceptable, that we refuse to be complacent in this genocide, and we refuse to be affiliated with a university or with an institution that is aligning itself very clearly with colonizers, especially in a place where there are so many indigenous people. And so I would like to name that it's very unfortunate that not a lot of people are aware of all of the different ways that we have gone through their procedures and their protocols to demand justice and to peacefully, non-violently actually ask them to consider divestment and to begin the process, and it's not happening. So because we are not being heard, we are being moved to take greater strides to be heard. And I feel like that's the reason why we are in an encampment. We fund, students fund the duck pond and a lot of the amenities around that university. We pay for that university, and we refuse to be complacent in our monies being used for genocide. And so I would like to name, like, there's been a lot of moments where it's been very difficult. Today is day 6. We have been staying in the encampment, resting at nighttime, and really articulating ourselves and spreading this message of solidarity and liberation in the daytime with anybody who's willing to listen. And still, we are being, like, portrayed as violent people, as outsiders, as agitators, when we love and care about that university and the encampment in the ways that we have created spaces for food, for mutual aid, for a medic station, as well as a space for students during finals week to just rest and to take care, should be a clear image and message enough that we are here in a good way, and that we are here to really just mobilize people and to bring awareness to what's happening, but also to demand that the institution not use our money to fund genocide and that it divests. We don't think that it is completely impossible for the university to divest because we use the same divestment resolution language that was used in 1985 at the university, demanding that they divest from South Africa. Apartheid. So we are using the exact same language. We are explicitly asking the university to stand by its values that it already has had for over 40 years. And they are telling us and showing us that money is more important. Funding genocide and being complacent in it is more important.
Well, you know, I have to say I'm pretty moved by your guys' movement there. I mean, you guys have been peaceful your entire time being there. You guys have not been a nuisance. In fact, I've seen the police give you guys a lot of problems. And we're going to actually play some footage now for everyone so they can see what your time's been like there, some of the protests, some of the police stuff there. Thank you for coming to talk with me, Siihasin. It's been really nice and helping me answer this question. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Peace. U.S. out of the Middle East, no justice, no peace.
Can I get your badge number, ma'am? I'm going to ask you every time, every interaction. What's your badge number, sir?
They have to go to your vehicle?
What's your badge number, sir?
1259.
You already get a notice? No? No. If that doesn't make your vehicle, when you ride your vehicle, if you don't abide by that, you will be under it.
Can you get a translated one? Thank you. That's the first time they threatened arrest.
Yeah, this is the first time they're threatening arrest.
Gone on too long. Another sleeping bag, that one needs to go.
What's going on?
You said that we're allowed to be here.
You are allowed to.
Can you
aren't allowed
tell
to
me
have
where the sleeping bag is right here?
Oh,
That's a
so
jacket.
there's no
That's a
sleeping bag.
jacket.
Okay, we don't
The
need
black
pillows.
one over there,
The
ma'am.
sleeping bag needs to go. Who's
And then the
this?
pillows
What's
here,
your name
ma'am.
and number? Who's this?
Your name and number, ma'am.
Your name and number.
Just need pictures.
And name? Sleeping bag? Whose sleeping bag is this?
Your name, 1238.
You can look it up. Whose sleeping bag is this?
Your name, though.
We're entitled to this information. You're on duty. Can I ask for your supervisor's information?
Whose sleeping bag is this?
I don't know who that is, ma'am. Can you be more specific?
I'm not gonna do it.
Who is your supervisor?
Can I take this?
I don't know. You said he was just here.
That's not yours.
Nobody wants to play.
Who is your supervisor,
On
ma'am?
property.
Who is your supervisor? This is the fourth time I'm asking.
Excuse me, guys.
Is it yours?
That's the real question.
Arrested or detained by your boss. Straight up, you got a warrant for that?
Whose is this?
You got a warrant for it?
You got a warrant?
If it's not yours, it's
got
not
a
yours
warrant?
either.
But you have a warrant?
Show us the law.
It's public property. It's
Show us the
abandoned
law.
property.
Show us the law. Take it out.
How is it abandoned? We're all here.
Nobody's claiming it.
Show us the law.
Is it yours?
Collectively. You got a warrant?
Does it?
You all collectively claim it? Is it yours?
It belongs to the people.
Is it yours?
Yeah, it belongs to the people. That's people's.
It's everyone's. It's yours. It's
How would
ours.
you like it if we came and took
I told you it belongs to
I'm
the.
going to give
sleeping
you
good.
this since you seem to be the ringleader here.
I am not accepting. There's no ringleader here.
We're going to be taking all this stuff down if we can't cooperate.
Sure, yeah.
My supervisor.
I'm just asked
Go
you.
ahead and try it.
And I'm not the ringleader. None of us are alone in this.
Can I ask for your supervisor's name once again, ma'am? You can say he's about to be here. He was just here. I'm asking you for his name. Thank you.
Whose sleeping bag is this?
So that's Guadalupe P. Guevaro, Lieutenant Commander, UNMPD. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I'm letting people know so that they can call. We have. It doesn't matter.
It does matter. It's abandoned property.
You can
Nobody's claiming
leave.
it.
It's not abandoned.
Okay, I'm going to read this to you guys because you don't really seem to understand. Nobody wants to take it. I've been told to relay this
Policy
and
does
read
not
it.
trump law.
As the provost and executive vice president for academic affairs
En
of the
español.
university.
Dude, that's an antique. You can't touch it like that.
Like, you printed a whole new fucking notice in yellow highlighted and it doesn't even have the right date.
We've been here all week. Now you want to do this? Go on. Go ahead. Go on. Go on. Go on.
This is so unnecessary. It's 12 in the fucking morning.
Go on.
Are being seen all around the world. The people in Palestine itself